Hi guys, Valentina here, ValentinaPetrovaConsulting.com. And this is another little useful daily psychology video that has to do with addictions, especially people who are in relationships with addicts. I'm going to try to briefly explain to you what really goes on in the chemistry and the mind of an addict, and then hopefully that will help you realize how difficult these relationships can be, and then decide whether or not it's worth for you sticking around. And now, saying this, I realized that sometimes people are in long-term relationships, and the addiction comes on later on in the relationship, and there's a lot at stake, perhaps children, property, whatnot, a lot of investment emotionally and otherwise into the relationship. So it's not as easy to just pick up and go. And at the same time, people who are addicted to various substances are not totally hopeless. They could straighten up and do better and perhaps resolve the issues. But as we all know, it will never happen until they actually realize that they have a problem. And that's just the first step. Anybody that's been in a 12-step program knows that acceptance is the first step, but then there's a lot more to be done for someone to be functioning normally again, and not be subjected to the negative effects of the addiction. Just some people believe that once you're addicted to something, you're always addicted. It just becomes a behavior modification issue where you don't have to be taking the substance anymore, but there is still something inside of you that would possibly swing you in the direction of addiction if you're to take that substance even once more. So this is definitely a very complicated issue, so I'm going to try to simplify it, and by all means, I cannot cover all the cases. Clearly, all relationships are unique in their dynamics, based on the life experiences and just the character of the people involved, and how things came to be matters as well. So clearly, I cannot do all this in just a 10-minute video, but at least I'll give you some ideas and some pointers, and hopefully that will be helpful to people. And then if you need help beyond this informative video, you should see a therapist. If you're a couple, you should also, if somebody is addicted, they definitely need the help of others. It's very difficult to abolish an addiction all on your own. There's a lot of work to be done around that issue. So the support of others is very important, whether 12-step programs or therapists, or even medical assistance. So here we go. What goes on in the mind of an addict? I would think like the simplest way to explain it is stress. And a specific kind of stress, we call this dissonance. That's the stress that one feels when their self-image does not quite match their actions. So they think of themselves as a normal person, and they see that they're doing things abnormally, and that is driving them crazy. That's actually creating stress. So with that comes, self-judgment and other things. So why they got to that point, it can be various reasons, but that is the point where things begin to develop, is when you have that dissonance. So your actions don't match your self-image and the image you're trying to portray of yourself to others. So simple way to say it, the person you're being is not the person you actually want to be. And so addictions become coping behaviors. So we can say we have three types of relationships with ourselves. The first one is consonant relationship, which is essentially zero stress, zero dissonance. In other words, a belief, an idea, a thought, an intention that we have is basically consistent with our actions. So if we say we're going to do something, we do it. If we say that we don't smoke, we don't smoke. If we say that we don't drink, we don't drink. We're consistent. Okay. The second type of relationship it's called irrelevant relationship. It's where our actions are irrelevant to our beliefs, ideas, and intentions, sort of like redirecting the energy kind of a thing. Like, for example, we say that smoking is not good for us and we're going to quit smoking. So we go out with some friends and somebody's passing around cigarettes, and we don't want to smoke, but we can't really deal with it, so we go and we get drinks and start drinking or drinking coffee. So we're not addressing the psychological underpinnings of our habits. We're just redirecting the energy towards other actions. So that becomes very common. Like if you go to AA meetings, you'll see a lot of the people in AA meetings are now addicted to cigarettes and drinking coffee. They're no longer drinking alcohol, but instead they're pumping cigarettes and coffee into their systems. So that's redirection. It's not really solving the problem. It's better than being an alcoholic, clearly, but it's still not really the best solution. But you have low level of dissonance. You know what you're doing. You really know that your other behaviors are coping behaviors for your addiction. And so you're still kind of stressed because you haven't really completely given up the dependency. So the third kind of a relationship we have with ourselves is called a dissonant relationship. And that's when our thoughts and intentions and beliefs completely mismatch, do not match our actions. So we say we're not going to drink anymore, and then we go out, and then we get drunk and come home drunk, and then we feel the stress of that tomorrow because of the realization that we couldn't resist, and we get involved in self-judgment and all that. So high level of stress produces high level of stress. We can't quite sync our actions with our beliefs and intentions and thoughts. And so what happens when the body's in a dissonant relationship, when it has that high level of stress? What it does is produces a lot of adrenaline and cortisol. So those things are running through your system on regular basis. So the more you are the person is unable to coordinate accordingly their actions to their intentions and their thoughts, the more internal stress they feel, the more adrenaline and cortisol are running through the body. Well, that usually is not an issue. We feel some level of adrenaline and cortisol running through our system in all sorts of natural circumstances these days. Maybe you need to do a presentation in front of a bunch of people and you're nervous. That's fine. You have that surge of adrenaline and that surge of cortisol. You're running a marathon or you're in a competitive sport. You feel those things coming through your system. It gives you energy, focuses your attention. It's a good thing. It's a bad thing when there's a lot of it and it's consistently pumped into your system, because your cells become accustomed to that level of chemical passing through. Not only that, but they begin to sort of like want more of that chemical. Like they develop more receptors for the chemical. If the system is flooded with certain chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol, your cells will begin to absorb more of that, and then the new cells that are being created from your cells as the cells are divided will be more resistant and more able to absorb these chemicals. So you start to, in a way, kind of tolerate more stress, which is counterproductive in this case for addictions, because in other words, you start to minimize your dissonance, your actions not matching your words, or be more tolerant to the feelings of that dissonance, and may prevent you from taking action to get rid of your addiction. But another thing that happens is, no matter what level of adrenaline and cortisol your body's producing, it wants to get rid of it. And so if by trial and error you have found out that coming home to a glass of wine is reducing your stress level, you know that's a winning strategy. So every time you're stressed out, you're going to come home and drink some wine. If you happen to be smoking pot, pot is helping you unwind. So your body learns that these other chemicals are helpful to counteract the negative effects of adrenaline and cortisol. So, we're just cause and effect. You learn, your system learns. That's one reason we eat comfort foods too. We know it works, even though it's not the healthiest thing to do. For the moment, you get gratification. And so if you're stressed out and your body's full of adrenaline and cortisol, and you smoke some pot, now you got more dopamine in your system, and things are just fine. However, if this is your only strategy to combat your stress, eventually you become dependent on the substance, whatever that is, whether it's pot or alcohol or comfort food, whatever it is that helps you produce dopamine and serotonin in your body. You're going to seek that substance for feeling better. And since the particular stress we're talking about, is not just work-related stress or life-related stress, it's the stress that comes from self-judgment and non-acceptance. Then the numbing effects of alcohol and drugs become an easy fix. So we start producing dopamine, which leads to pleasure. The more dopamine in your system, the more pleasure you feel. But it's not sustainable, because as soon as the effects of that particular chemical or that particular action, maybe it's gambling or whatever it is, wear out, you still feel dissonance. In fact, you increase the level of dissonance because you realize that what you're doing with your substance addiction or substance dependency or chemical dependency, if you want to call it, you realize that that's not the healthiest thing, and there are negative effects of it, negative repercussions of it, depending on the drugs you're using or how much you're drinking and gambling and all that. It can really be disastrous to your life. So you're now stuck in this weird vortex of, seeking to alleviate the stress created by consumption of these substances or by the behaviors that you are doing. You're seeking to alleviate the stress, and the quickest way to alleviate the stress is to do the behaviors and to use the substances. And so it becomes like a perpetual machine of tension and release and tension and release. And it escalates because especially with dopamine, the body builds up resistance. So you're going to need more of the substance to get the same effect. And every druggie out there will tell you that. It's a little bit of coke, then it's a lot of coke. It's a little bit of heroin, and then it's an overdose. It just escalates over time because it's impossible to get the release without upping the dose, because you're building up resistance to the dopamine. So it's kind of a crazy thing, really, chemically, what goes on in the brain, and it, yes, translates into behavior. And what is the behavior? The behavior is that, first of all, the stress of judging yourself and realizing your situation and yet being unable to solve it, or unwilling sometimes, or sometimes not even realizing it, but you kind of know that something is going on. And then you have the nagging of everybody around you. If you're in a relationship, your partner will be like, what the hell are you doing? And they will be unhappy, and then you'll feel responsible for that. And so it's a very negative experience of life, basically, and stressful. The stress is felt by those around who are not addicted, and they're trying to figure out what's really going on with the addict. Are they really addicted? And nobody wants to wake up and realize that their partner, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their husband, their wife, whatever the situation is actually an alcoholic. And there's shame that goes with that too. It's like, oh my God, and then I grew up in a family where we've had alcoholics in the family. And my aunt was an alcoholic. It was a terrible thing. And over time, it escalated to a point where she was incapacitated. She was unable to function in life, and also unable to kick the addiction, even though she went to detox and blah, blah, blah several times. It was really difficult, and the people around her didn't know how to deal with it, and they tried to not give her any money so she wouldn't go out there and buy alcohol. Well, she figured out she can go to the neighbors, knock on the door, and ask for a glass of alcohol for some pretense, like she needed it for cooking or something. And then she got even more creative when her kids told the neighbors not to give her any alcohol. She went down the street to the little farmer's market that was going on every day and find some guy who sold alcohol and told him she was going to work for free or for a very small pay. And he didn't realize that really what she wanted is to have access to alcohol. So anyway, just they become very clever at feeding the addiction, whatever the addiction is. And they get the fix, they get their fix, and they feel well for a moment. And then when they sober up, they realize what they've done and they feel bad about it. So the addict themselves, they are stuck in this horrible cycle, having to feed the addiction to alleviate the stress that's really caused by the addiction, and it just gets worse and worse. And my brother was a heroin addict from the age of about 18 or something, and he got really bad. And afterwards, he went through rehab and sobered up. But, it took years for him to kick the heroin addiction. But he didn't resolve the underlying issues, never even investigated why he would be susceptible and why he would fall into that pattern. And so he kind of redirected the behavior towards other things and ended up being a gambler. He wasn't doing heroin anymore, but he was gambling. So, a few years after his rehab, I sat him down and I said, well, tell me, like, how did you feel while you were on heroin? And he said, well, honestly, I didn't give a fuck. The only thing I cared about is getting my next dose. And I knew that what I was doing was not right, and the things he was doing were terrible. Like, he'd beat up on old ladies to get their few bucks. He would steal things. He would lie. He would, be very violent and all kinds of stuff to get access to the drugs. And yes, it started out as party time sometimes, and then it ended up every day, and then it ended up all the time. And so he ended up overdosing twice, and the second time barely saved his life, and still he had no intention of quitting. He knew it was harmful, but it gets to a point where the damage done to their lives is so huge that they cannot face the consequences. So that's why in the drug world, it's sort of like you have to hit bottom to even have a chance to change. And some of them hit bottom and realize it's a huge bottom and they rather just die. So that's what my brother was saying, is that his life felt like such a waste that he just couldn't. When he was sober, when he looked around, he realized the massive amount of damage he was doing to himself and his family, and how low he has fallen, that he actually did not want to live. So he was actually hoping to overdose and die. But life had it another way, so he ended up in a rehab center and blah, 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 and came out on the other side, a gambler. Go figure, right? So these are very complicated things. It's very scary. So how do you know? Like, say you are just a regular user, especially pot these days and alcohol, easily accessible. We live in California, wine country, everywhere, wine tastings. And, people go out to drink wine. It's like a favorite pastime. At what point is wine an addiction? At what point is alcohol an addiction? Same thing with pot. Pot is legal now. Everybody can get to it. It's not that expensive. It's massively produced in California. We grow better pot than Mexico. The Mexicans want our pot now. And so people can grow it in their backyard. 6 plants per household or whatever it is. It's totally legal. Grow your own pot like you're growing your own tomatoes and, consume it for yourself. So at what point are you actually having an issue with pot? Well, 91% of the population does not get addicted to pot. But what about the other 9%? So anything can be addictive. Any substance can be addictive, especially substances that provide pleasure very fast. All chemicals, drugs, things like that. So at what point does it become an addiction? So if you're a self-reflective person, you're going to notice that you're seeking the substance to alleviate symptoms. And if that's what you're doing consistently and you feel dependent on the substance, whatever it is, to alleviate your symptoms, you have an issue. If you cannot control the substance and it controls you, in other words, you're dependent on it, you have an issue. And, can you quit? Well, thousands of people quit every day, all kinds of things, and come out on the other end better people. So it's not impossible to give up an addiction. It is difficult to give up an addiction. The deeper you are into it, the more difficult it is. But it's not impossible. Now, for the people around the addicts, their partners, their children, their parents, and all that, life is confusing because now the person you knew is different. They're under the influence of the chemicals, the substances they're putting into their system, and they are in this terrible cycle of self-judgment and self-gratification. And so when you're having conversation with them, you have to understand that you're not having a conversation with a rational mind. You're not having a conversation with a normal person. They are warped. Their reality is warped. And so if you bring up the issue to them and say, hey, I think you might be having a problem with pot or with alcohol. Do you want to look into it? You're going to get like, what? No way, You don't know what you're talking about. You're just being a bitch, Or you might get, yeah, I know, I'm watching it, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen, You're going to get some kind of an answer, positive or negative. And at that moment, they can probably believe it. Let's say they say, yeah, I know, I don't know what's going on, but yeah, definitely I can see there's a problem here and I'm working on it. And at that moment, the person is completely sincere. They're 100% sincere. They actually don't want to be a yo-yo, They don't want to be chemically dependent. They don't want to ruin their lives. They don't want to ruin their relationships. We're talking about normal people. So, Sorry, I'm making this video on my phone and my phone just rang. So it's turned off. So you're having a conversation with your partner or your child or your parent that are addicts, and and they're just like, yeah, I'll take care of it, whatnot. They're sincere, and then they don't, and then they don't, and then they don't. And then you just keep having the same conversations, going over the same things, and nothing changes. In fact, it gets worse because it escalates. Addictions tend to escalate. So, how do you know your partner is an addict before they realize they're one? Can you spot the trend? So here's one way to spot the trend. Like, let's say you guys go hiking. Says you're gonna go hiking for the next 3 days, and there's no access to the drugs they use or the alcohol they drink or whatnot. How do they respond? How do they respond in an environment without having access to what they usually use? So we're talking about chronic users, people that use whatever they use every day. If they lack the substance, several things happen. Obviously, they go through withdrawals. So withdrawals are, depending on the substance and how addicted they are, can be pretty severe. Different drugs have different kinds of withdrawals. Even things like, people are throwing up, going into hallucinations and shivering and sweating and all kinds of stuff. So, heavier duty drugs might require, medical assisted detoxing where they can be supervised and managed. But let's say you live in a household with a pot smoker and you never thought pot was addictive, and your partner is smoking pot all the time, or let's say you're living with someone who's drinking and all that. So, they're going to become irritability, headaches, paranoia, short temper, huge emotional swings. Those are all signs of withdrawal. So you say you're a pot smoker or your partner is a pot smoker and everything seems normal to you, and then they don't get pot for 2-3 days, and all of a sudden they're turning into a nightmare for you within 48 hours. That's a good indication the person was addicted to pot. They start getting irritable, they don't make any sense, they argue about everything, and the other thing they do is they ramp up alcohol consumption. Pot and alcohol have similar effects chemically on the system. So if somebody tries to prove that they're not a pot smoker, they're not addicted to pot, and they stop smoking pot, you're 100% going to see them ramping up alcohol consumption. They're going to wake up in the morning to a stiff drink. They're going to have to drink every 4 to 6 hours, get a shot of whiskey, whatever, something heavy duty, like a mimosa is not going to do it. One beer is not going to do it. It's going to be 2, 3, 4 beers. So that's an indication that, they're trying to deal with the withdrawals of the cannabis. They get depressed. So if you've tried to stop smoking pot or stop drinking alcohol, chances are that after a day or two you're going to start getting very depressed. The worst side effects or the worst withdrawal symptoms appear between 48 and 72 hours. So that's where you're going to see the peak of the negative experience, which is why it's good to have support. It's good to have people around you who understand what's going on and can help you out. So what do you do? What do you do if you are with an addict? Bail. I'd say bail. If you're not very invested in the relationship, it's a new relationship perhaps, or it's not something that, you're dependent on, you're a grown-up child and your parents are having issues or all that, you can just pack up and leave and say, you know what, this is what I think it is, and unless you're willing to help yourself, I'm not going to stick around to pick up the pieces for you. I'm sorry, I got my own life to worry about. And sounds pretty selfish, really, but you have to understand, you have no control over them. And really depends on the addict. 100% depends on them to pick themselves up and go. You cannot fix them. You can only support their fixing process with them, but unless they're doing it, you can't do it for them. It's impossible. And at least for me, these kinds of things are deal breakers. And so new relationships, bail. If you're in a relationship for a long time and this starts to happen, you might want to stay there and help your partner out if they want to be helped. And if they don't want to be helped, you have to set some strict boundaries so your life otherwise is not affected by it. And you keep encouraging them to look into it and all that, and you can do various things. Make sure you split your accounts so they're not spending your money getting drugs. Limit access to things, make rules. Alcoholics like to hide their booze. Druggies like to hide their drugs. So, you make sure you sweep the house clean from top to bottom once in a while. And you just don't let them get away with shit. You keep saying, look, you have a problem. If you're hiding whiskey in the washing machine, you are having a problem. If you're sneaking out to smoke pot, you're having a problem. Like whatever it is, you keep calling them on it until hopefully they realize that they have a problem. And if it gets worse and worse and they become abusive and destructive, bail. I don't care how long you spend in the relationship. Your safety is the most important thing. Get the fuck out. And if they're actually sincere in helping themselves and going through whatever they need to be going through, shrinks therapy, 12-step programs, then you can stay and be supportive and really scrub the environment clean from the substances that are tempting to them and try to help them out as much as you can. But again, they have to be helping themselves actively. Otherwise, no go. So that's it. That's pretty much where it ends. A lot of people die because of various chemical dependencies, and a lot of people become totally functional. They figure it out and move on and become wiser for it, more compassionate towards others and helpful towards other addicts on the way of recovery. So it's not the end of the world, but it can be. It's not the end of a relationship, but it could be and it should be if it's really destructive. So that's all I got to say. And if you need help, please get it. And if you need my help, please get it. I'm not a drug counselor, but I can tell you straight up shit. So I don't know if you're going to like me. But anyhow, and if you're in a relationship with an addict and you need a little strength to figure it out, hey, I'm a good person to help you out. So if you need me, ValentinaPetrovaConsulting.com, and have yourself a nice day. Bye.